I'm Mark Ford from WorthingDigital, talking to Applied Futurist Tom Cheesewright for Here and Now. So I guess, Tom, we should start with, you're a futurist. What's that?
So I work with companies and people around the world, typically large companies, to really try and answer three questions. Firstly, what does our future look like? Companies that come to me are typically quite concerned or potentially excited about what the future holds. They have this sense that change is happening faster now, and they want to change the way they think about the future to be a bit more responsive. So that leads to the second question, which is, once we understand that future, how do we tell that story? And there's no point having a vision of the future if we can't communicate it to our customers or our shareholders or our board to try and secure investment or whatever else it may be. So I help them with that storytelling piece. And thirdly, we get to the really knotty problem, which is, once we've seen a vision of the future and we've convinced everybody else about it, what on earth do we do about it? And that generally gets me involved in sort of change and innovation programs, trying to help companies change the way they operate on a day-to-day basis to be more responsive to this current period of high frequency change.
We talked before this about the sort of types of things that you think are coming along, and one of the sort of phrases that sprung to mind for me was kind of ambient computing. So, you know, we're expecting just to be able to blurt something out and it will be responded to in some way by a system. Is that the sort of thing that you're sort of starting to think about now, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my underlying principles is that the biggest driver of change right now, the most consistent driver of change, is technology. And if you rewind over the last 50 years, some really interesting things have happened in that pattern. We know that computers have gotten smaller. We know they've gotten more powerful. We know they've gotten cheaper. But in many ways, it's the use to which we put that capability that's been really interesting. Because if you wanted to make a piece of technology do something 50 years ago, a computer do something 50, 60 years ago, you were looking at an incredibly difficult manual process to try and encode those actions. You were having to do an awful lot of working out beforehand. You had to either punch them into punch cards or create an incredibly complex computer script in a language that the machine understood. Fast forward through the eras of graphical user interfaces and point and click icons of the mouse and touch screens to today. And I have to be careful how I say this now, but if I sort of speak to my voice assistant and ask for a particular song to be played, there's a good chance, maybe 1 in 2, that it'll actually play the song I want. And that has offloaded an enormous amount of work to the machine. We've outsourced all of that initial thought and sort of conscious rigor that we had to go through to make a machine do something to the machine itself. And as that happens, we become less and less conscious of the machine being any sort of technology. It just sort of disappears into the background. There's this old phrase that technology is anything invented after you were born. Well, even things that are invented long after you were born, if they're just invisible, if they just work, if the interface with them is so intuitive that it maps against things we've been learning how to do, evolving how to do for millions of years, then it becomes invisible. And this phrase, ambient technology, the world just responding to our needs, even without us necessarily having to vocalize them almost instantaneously.
Yeah, it's funny. The quote you've used reminded me of one of my favorite Douglas Adams quotes. So it's I've come up with a set of rules to describe our reactions to technology. Anything that is in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary and just part of the way the world works. 2, anything that's invented when you're between 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary. You can probably make a career in it. Anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. I think we quite a few of us feel like that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it's interesting how, I guess I'd call it semi-generational. There is that natural acceptance of these things at below a certain age, an excitement and enthusiasm, and quite often a sort of naivety about them between 2 ages, and then an inherent rejection of them after that. And I say it's semi-generational because there are lots of people clearly beyond those ages who are very enthusiastic about those technologies and leap in with both feet. But I think you can really see that actually with social media behavior. Those people who came late to social media, and we still have this now. I've literally just got off a radio interview about the ills of social media, and isn't it all terrible, and shouldn't we shut it all down? It's not quite like that, but you still hear a lot of that sentiment, even though probably the majority of Facebook users now, it feels like, are well over 40. You've got the group who are younger than them, for whom it was an absolute novelty, and jumped in with both feet and documented their entire lives, visually or across a multitude of platforms. And for that group, I really feel sorry for now, because they've given away so much of their privacy that can never be taken back. And I'm very pleased that I went to university before the advent of social media, and my entire life isn't documented in inescapable digital form. But then you've got the generation after that who've come to it with actually a much greater degree of sort of conscious understanding, because they've grown up with it and they've seen it and they've seen the negative sides of it. Their social media behavior is really interesting. It's what's driven the adoption of things like Snapchat, these conscious choices about which are the right networks to do certain things, about what the trade-off is between what you get from the social network and what you're giving away in terms of your privacy. And I think those three age bands actually describe that really well.
Yeah, it's funny. That's kind of made me think about. I was listening to a talk yesterday that we had a guy gave 4 years ago. He was talking about wearable technology, and the phrase "the quantified self" came up, and I thought that's something I haven't really thought about for a long time, because back then I was getting quite keen on, like, I had a Fitbit and I had Fitbit scales, and measuring everything that I was doing all the time, and that's really fallen. Well, I think it has fallen by the wayside more recently. There was kind of a peak of it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and that's disappeared again now. But don't really know where I'm going with that, but you just made me think of it. So, okay, just give us a quick idea of what the sort of things you're going to be covering when you're down talking to us next month. I think we might have already gone over a lot.
Yeah, I think this idea that as technology disappears, lots of things happen in that process. So it becomes more accessible. It becomes more of a sort of consumer technology and less of a sort of an engineering technology. A good example, rewind again to the last century, and if you owned a car, you largely knew how to maintain a car. I have strong visions of my dad in the 1980s on a cold winter's morning, pulling all the spark plugs out, sticking them in a vise, heating them up with a blowtorch, and sticking them back in the engine to get the car to start. I don't think anybody now would know how to do that, even if it were possible, with the various plastic covers on the engines. And the same is happening with computing technology. It's becoming in many ways more accessible to many more people, but also it's becoming sort of hidden away and buried and less acceptable to the vast majority of the populace. And so there's this interesting interim period where more of us are being able to hack it and do interesting things with it, but ultimately it's disappearing, it's becoming invisible. And I'm interested in what that means for us as human beings, as we are becoming increasingly reliant on it, but less cognizant of how it works. I'm interested in what it means for commerce. One thing I absolutely see happening is this outsourcing buying decisions to machines in relatively short order. I would quite happily outsource the buying of, toothpaste and toilet rolls and tins of tomatoes to a machine, as long as it meant I never ran out of those sort of absolutely vital staples for particularly the tins of tomatoes for anybody with kids who live on pasta. There's aspects of this in terms of, it affects transport, it affects, what it means to be human, it affects security. Think if we are, how do we consider cybercrime when that cybercrime affects a piece of what we increasingly to be considered to be ourselves, whether that's a digitally enhanced memory, whether that's digitally enhanced capability to do your job. There's all sorts of interesting implications for how we treat security and cybercrime and privacy actually in this age as well. Where does this processing power sit, this invisible ambient computing upon which we'll increasingly rely? Who owns it? Who controls it? Who sets the rules? And the issues we're struggling with now, and they're only going to become more acute in the future.
I really like the analogy there. The other week I went to my car to top up the screen wash, and I sort of opened the boot, the bonnet, and looked at the engine, and just sort of, like you say, plastic covers everywhere, and just went, no, that's the thing I need to deal with, and I don't really care about the rest of it. I'm not interested. So that is definitely the way technology is going. Everybody's less and less interested in anything other than the immediate thing that they want to deal with. We're at a sort of halfway house now with the buying staples kind of thing, with things like dash buttons. where you can just like have a button next to the toilet to order more toilet roll or whatever. That's definitely sort of, you can see that's the way it's going to go.
Yeah, they're really clear interim technologies. I think you can quite often see interim technologies as gateways to where things are going to go. I remember seeing, must have been 20 years ago, a device for putting, downloading digital music and putting it on a mini disc player. It's like, that's not going to last, but it's an interesting pointer to where things are going. And absolutely, the dash button is another one. That we know that the back end in terms of sensing capability, understanding when you're running out of stuff, whether that's through computer vision, the mythical internet fridge, monitoring when the milk's going to go off. None of that stuff's quite there yet, but we know that someday it will be. So Amazon's building up the other end of the business to say, well, let's just get someone to push a button when they want something. Ultimately, that decision will be taken out of your hands if you want it to be. The particular class of technology does that, which is augmented reality. As soon as we are, all walking around with a probably pair of smart glasses on, something in which Apple and all the other companies are investing huge amounts. We have an always-on camera on our faces, probably 10 hours a day, capturing a vast array of information about our surroundings. And at that point, you don't need a smart fridge. You don't need, sensors everywhere, because you've got the best sensor, a visual sensor, capturing all that information as you go about your daily life, and then driving responses from that.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff coming along. I think there always is, but it just feels at the moment like, we're at the sort of cusp of another sort of big explosion of development in that area.
I'm not sure if it's a new one or if it's the sort of the crescendo of the last sort of 40 years of connected computers, 50 years, I guess now. It's that combination of connectivity, storage, and processing power, all increasing at an exponential rate. Almost has this inevitable conclusion that we apply that connected smarts to a greater and greater range of challenges.
Yeah, I think you're right. Great, thank you. Well, I guess if we ramble on for too much longer, you're not going to have any material left for your talk. So I'll leave it there. But looking forward to seeing you in October, and thank you very much.
Fantastic. Look forward to it.
Cheers.